Hello, everyone. I am Philip Tai, Director of the Northeastern University Asian Studies Program and Associate Professor of History and Asian Studies. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to our ongoing speaker series, Asia, America, and the World. We are very honored to present our fifth event today, featuring Professor Sangay Mishra. We're going to kick off the new semester and the new year with another great presentation. This inaugural series is part of a broader initiative by the Northeastern University to address student demands to bring more Asian American studies to campus after the waves of anti-Asian violence and bigotry last spring. And we also thought it was very important for us to think more expansively about Asian American studies by also considering the broader history and dynamics of the Asian diaspora. The talk today by Professor Mishra offers a reminder of the diversity of the category Asian American. Now, too often, the category refers to East Asian Americans, that is Chinese, Japanese, or Korean Americans in the minds of many people. Professor Mishra's talk brings the spotlight to South Asian Americans, who are, after all, the second largest group within the category of Asian Americans, as we all need to remember. And his talk, I should note, comes at an opportune time. Looking back at South Asian American experience 20 years after 9/11, and how that searing experience might highlight parallels and perhaps offer constructive actions for us to meet our current moment of anti-Asian violence and bigotry. Now, before I continue, I want to thank the support of many institutions and individuals here at Northeastern. I want to acknowledge the Office of the Provost, the College of Social Sciences and Humanities for their sponsorship, the Humanities Center for its co-sponsorship. I also want to thank people, including Senior Vice Provost Phil He and CSSH Dean Uta Poiger for their ongoing support. I also want to recognize the many people who did the hard work to make this event possible. Our Asian Studies program team, Mika Morikawa-Jo and Ezra Acevedo, the CSSH team of Gabby Fiorenza and Jen Grieve for their logistics, the marketing and communications team of Mike Farah and Najima Hollis-Huggins, Rachel Mu and her staff and students at the Asian American Center. Thank you all so very much. Now, for today's event, I will invite my colleague, Professor Liza Weinstein, to offer a few words. Professor Weinstein is chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and associate professor of sociology. She researches and teaches on cities and globalization, urban political economy, and the politics of informality with a regional focus on India. Her work has appeared in numerous journals and edited volumes. Her first book is entitled The Durable Slum, Darvi and the Right to Stay Put in Globalizing Mumbai. And her second forthcoming book is tentatively titled The Logics of Dispossession, Local Histories of India's World-Class Evictions, which we are all looking forward to reading. Professor Weinstein is also a very good member of the Northeastern University Asian Studies program, and her willingness to moderate this event is truly appreciated. She will introduce and invite our main speaker, Professor Sangay Mishra, to give his presentation. Afterwards, Professor Weinstein will moderate the discussion between the speaker and the audience. The audience is welcome to submit their questions in the chat box. And finally, I want to encourage the audience to stay until the end. We will announce details regarding a raffle to win copies of Professor Mishra's book. So please don't miss out. Thank you again for your time. And here, Professor Weinstein, I will hand it off to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tai. It really is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. I am, as Professor Tai said, an active and enthusiastic supporter, member, representative of the Asian Studies program here at Northeastern. And it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker for this really enlightening and empowering speaker series that I have enjoyed as a viewer and as an audience member for all of the other presentations, and I'm pleased to present here as a moderator. Dr. Sangay Mishra is an associate professor of political science and international relations at Drew University. Dr. Mishra's work focuses on issues of immigrant political incorporation, transnationalism, and racial and ethnic politics. He also researches the political participation of South Asian migrants in the United States, as well as countries of origin, with a particular focus on immigrants from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Professor Mishra received his Ph.D. in political science from the University of Southern California, Los Angeles. He has also held a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Lehigh University and served as the co-chair of the Asian and Pacific American Caucus of the American Political Science Association from 2014 to 2016. His award-winning book, Desi's Divided, which you will have an opportunity to potentially win in the raffle today. Desi's Divided, The Political Lives of South Asian Americans, was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2016, and for the South Asian market by Sage India the following year. The book was awarded the Best Book on Asian America by the American Sociological Association's section on Asia and Asian America. I am pleased to introduce his talk today, titled Race, Religion, and Belonging of South Asian Americans 20 Years After 9/11. And I really look forward to moderating a rich and vibrant discussion following his talk. So thank you. Without ado, Professor Mishra.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful series of public talks on Asian Americans. It is an honor to be speaking in this series at Northeastern. Thank you, Dr. Thai. Thank you, Dr. Weinstein, for this wonderful introduction. My talk is focused on the experience of South Asian Americans. They are a group of people who trace their origins to countries such as Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, and Maldives. South Asians are highly diverse, like other Asian Americans, and they are shaping the meaning of being Asian American today. When the category of Asian American became widely used as a political and racial identity in the wake of student movement of the 1960s, the popular perception, as Dr. Thai was mentioning, of Asian American was that of Japanese, Chinese, and to a certain extent, Korean Americans. The composition of Asian Americans, however, has changed dramatically over the last decades. A sizable section of Asian Americans is now South Asians, immigrants from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and Southeast Asians. Okay, I'm trying. Okay, that's good. The shift in internal composition of Asian Americans is evident in this table. The East Asian population was 43% of Asian American population in 2000, and it is down to 37% in 2016. In the same period, South Asian population went from 19 to 27% of Asian American population. The Southeast Asian share of the Asian American population also went down. This data is from 2016, but if we look at 2020 census data, the South Asian proportion of Asian American population has increased even more. So it is needless to say that to understand Asian American today, we have to understand South Asian Americans. There is another important reality of Asian American identity that I need to mention before moving forward. The popular perception is that South Asian Americans, people of India, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Nepali origin are not Asian Americans. Data from National Asian American Survey of 2016 provides an insight into the popular perception of who is considered Asian American. The survey asked this question: tell me if the group is likely to be Asian or Asian American. So the question is, tell me if Chinese are likely to be Asian or Asian American. Tell me if Indians are likely to be Asian or Asian American. And if you look at this slide, I'm drawing upon work by Jennifer Lee and Karthik Ramakrishnan, and their work shows that most whites, blacks, and Latinos agreed that Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans are Asian or Asian Americans. Only about 5% of whites reported that Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans are not likely to be Asian or Asian Americans. And among blacks and Latinos, about 10% said that these groups are not likely to be Asian or Asian American. The Asian ethnic group in the survey felt similarly. Only a small proportion thought that Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans are not likely to be Asian or Asian American. But when asked about Indians and Pakistanis, stark differences emerged, as you can see in the data. Uh, among whites, 41% reported that Indians are not likely to be Asian, and for Pakistani, the figure is even higher at 45%. While among Blacks and Latinos, approximately 35% said Indians are not Asian or Asian American, and they are just as likely as whites, 45%, to say that Pakistanis are not Asians. The most striking data for me was how other Asian Americans responded to the question of whether Indians and Pakistanis are Asian Americans or not. A significant number of them, specifically around 20% and more Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino, said that they are less likely to see Indians as not Asians, and even higher percentage of them do not see Pakistanis as Asians, right? So if we think about the data point to the difficulties of the category of Asian American and how popular perception of Asian American does not reflect the diversity of the community. Moreover, how the popular perception is not keeping pace with the fast changing composition of Asian American community. One of the challenges facing Asian American organizations and institutions, both academic and non-academic, is to engage deeply with the diversity within Asian Americans and to ensure that our work reflects this diversity. My own work deals with the issue of internal differentiation and contestation within South Asian community and how that shapes the political engagement and mobilization of the community. I'm going to present some of the findings from my own research on South Asian Americans. These findings point to the challenges of producing a politics that could unify the community in the face of internal differences and racialization in American society. In my work, I look at South Asian American political incorporation or inclusion. That is the way in which they become a part of the American political process. The term political incorporation has been traditionally used to study the process of inclusion of minority communities. It is defined in the following ways. Political incorporation is a process through which new groups begin to participate in politics and eventually achieve representation and influence in government. South Asian Americans are a part of successive waves of immigrant and minority groups that have struggled for greater inclusion in the US political process. There is a substantive body of scholarship that has looked at mobilization and incorporation pattern of different immigrant communities. The scholarship on immigrant and minority political incorporation has been shaped primarily by two approaches. The first, pluralist model or assimilationist model, is based on early European immigrant experience, that is Italian, Irish, and German. This model underscores the relative openness of the political process and predicts a bumpy but complete inclusion of contemporary non-white immigrants in mainstream political institutions. Ethnic mobilization is a major part of this model, at least in initial phases. Mobilizing as Italian and Irish are the classic examples of this. This literature grew out of a larger corpus of work that was broadly categorized under the rubric of immigrant assimilation. In contrast, the second model, which is called the racialization or minority group model, underscores the barriers to political inclusion faced by African Americans as the classic case of obstacle to minority incorporation. The model predicts that new non-white immigrants would reproduce the experiences of African American political incorporation, that would include partial, halting, and incomplete inclusion and a reliance on race-based mobilization. These two models thus have contrasting predictions about the extent and pace of inclusion of contemporary non-white immigrants. However, it is important to note that both models emphasize the central importance of unified ethno-racial mobilization for group political incorporation. So for political incorporation, it's important to have a unified group mobilization. Both models agree on that particular point. In the case of minority group or racialization model, ethno-racial mobilization is an enduring or permanent feature, whereas the pluralist model considers such mobilization only as temporary until the group becomes a part of the mainstream economic and political process. And they are drawing upon the experience of Italian and Irish, who generally became a part of the larger white identity, and then they did not need to mobilize around their ethnic identity. Both models agree that a unified ethno-racial mobilization is the way through which minorities initially achieve some level of political efficacy, leading to a greater political inclusion. Looking at South Asian experience, I argue in my work that the political mobilization and inclusion of South Asian communities in the US is deeply tied to internal group distinctions. So internal group distinctions are very, very important to understand South Asian American experience. Furthermore, the precise nature of mobilization could be better explained by foregrounding these important cleavages within the group. These cleavages make unified mobilization extremely challenging. These distinctions could include class, religion, nation of origin, gender, sexuality, and caste, among others. The South Asian experience suggests that the notion of a unified mobilization, whether it's Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, or a broader mobilization, which is South Asian, is complicated by internal cleavages within these communities. In addition, a unified ethno-racial mobilization is not a precondition for political representation and influence, and we see a trend where two become disconnected. So the last point is about the fact that you don't need ethnic mobilization for political representation. When we look at South Asian experience, we get a dynamics like that, which I'll explain in a bit. To illustrate this argument, I will present my analysis of two different spheres of political mobilization among South Asian Americans. The first looks at racialization of South Asians in the aftermath of 9/11 terrorist attacks. And the second one is concerned with political representation in the electoral arena. When we look at the period after September 11, 2001, it was clear that religious identities not only became an important axis for racialization of South Asians, but they also shaped the mobilization against racialization. The evidence suggests that in reaction to 9/11 attacks, there was a lumping of all South Asians along with Arab Americans on the basis of their appearance as outsider, suspicious, and threatening. There were attacks on South Asians all across the nation. Even while Muslims were the prime target of law enforcement agencies, many Americans aimed a generalized hostility against people who looked Muslim, foregrounding a brown racial identity that included South Asians of different religious faiths, such as Muslims, Sikhs, Hindu, and Christians. In fact, the first person killed in racial backlash prompted by 9/11 attack was Balbir Singh Sodhi. He was a person of Sikh faith and an immigrant from India based in Mesa, Arizona. He was killed in a hate violence on September 15, 2001, while he was working at a gas station in Mesa. The killer reportedly expressed that he wanted to retaliate against 9/11 attacks by Muslim terrorists. This is Balbir Singh Sodhi's turban that his family kindly donated to Smithsonian. The racial lumping of South Asians points towards the elasticity of the racial constructions of those appearing to be Muslim in the post 9/11 period. In fact, you do not have to be a Muslim to be Muslim looking. Muslim looking almost became a racial category. Racial lumping using religious categories such as Muslim became the experience of South Asians in the post 9/11 period. The The impact of racial hostility on South Asian communities was reflected in interviews that I conducted with Indians, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshi community members in 2006 and 7 in Los Angeles and New York City. The respondent came from different diverse religious communities, but all of them acknowledged facing hostility based on racial lumping. A Gujarati Hindu interviewee based in Los Angeles expressed his feeling in the following words. When they look at us, they always think we are from somewhere else because of our skin color. Maybe they think that we are all terrorists or something. I don't know. They try to connect us to those people, 9/11 attackers. Speaking of Muslim experience, a young Muslim immigrant of Pakistani origin based in Brooklyn, New York City, expressed his fears in the following words. There was a genuine suspicion of Muslims and defensiveness on the part of Muslims. Just makes you walk around the streets much more carefully. I have learned to be much more defensive in public situations. Certain people get angry, not everyone. I just mean have a defensive, self-protective demeanor. Now, some scholars have argued that racialization process is directly linked to the possibilities of forming broader pan-ethnic solidarity where impacted people band together. So those who were impacted by racialization, hate violence, they should come together because of the dynamics of racialization, because they are lumped together. They suggest that external threats lead to the intensification of group cohesion as members react in defensive solidarities and develop common interests where none may have existed before. According to this framework, a distinct possibility of a solidarity-based pan-ethnic mobilizational response existed among South Asians in the post-9/11 period. And here I'm thinking of Yenli Spiritu's work from sociology, who identified the killing of Vincent Chen in 1982 as one such moment of pan-ethnic solidarity among Asian Americans. So the question that I asked in my work was whether post-9/11 racialization and violence against South Asian was a Vincent Chen moment for them. The South Asian experience in the post-9/11 period presents a very different picture and does not go along with the argument of solidarity and coming together. When we look at the responses of different South Asian communities to racial targeting after 9/11, it was apparent that they broke down significantly along the lines of religious identity, with a certain amount of slippage between religious and national identity. When asked about the possibility of a unified campaign against racial targeting after September 11th, a New York-based Hindu Indian community leader said, Hindus must be supporting Sikhs on that sort of campaign, but I do not see any way that Pakistanis, Indians, and Bangladeshis can meet. Religion is a big divide. It really is. It is not only a feeling, but it is there in practical life also, even in India. I think Hindus do not trust Muslims, whether Muslims would go for India or for Pakistan. The statement points to the fault lines within the South Asian community and the possible hurdles to unified response to racial targeting. In my book, I also talk about the sort of the transnational dimension of this whole divide, religious divide within the community. And if anyone is following politics in India today, then you would know that religious polarization is one of the major features of Indian society and politics today. And what is happening in India today is directly impacting the ways in which diaspora is mobilizing, reacting, and engaging with each other. So to conclude this section, we witness distinct mobilization or lack of mobilization within the community where religious identity plays an important role. In some cases, they are able to come together to challenge hate crime and targeting, but there are enough examples of drifting apart, pointing to the challenges of a unified mobilization. Religion is an important distinction within the community that has produced distinct mobilization in the post-9/11 period, demonstrating the challenges of a unified South Asian mobilization. I want to briefly think about the Pakistani American experience here. Being an overwhelmingly Muslim community, the option of distancing from the targeted Muslim identity was not available for them. The targeted religious identity, being Muslim, became even more salient for them. A lot of my Pakistani American interviewees talked about how for younger Pakistani Americans, their Muslim identity became prominent perhaps for the first time. In fact, many of them did not think of the religious side of their identity that much before 9/11. It has been a challenging period for the community, for Pakistani American community. However, on the positive side, their political engagement in the US became more important, and investment in Muslim civil rights organizations became highly important. The 9/11 experience had generated tremendous level of political engagement among Pakistani Americans and Muslims, but I would say among South Asians in general, whether Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, or Christians. The first Muslim woman city council member in NYC was elected in 2021. Her name is Shahana Hanif, and she is of Bangladeshi origin. When you look at her political identity, it's very clear that her identity is deeply shaped by her community's experience in the post 9/11 period. The second example I want to present pertains to, so I'm moving to my second example now, and that pertains to political representation of South Asians in the American political system. It is important to note that there are hardly any electoral districts with significant South Asian presence in the US. That is almost a structural feature of the US electoral system that South Asians have to deal with. The analysis of data that I have done on South Asian political representation suggests an interesting trend, that is growing number of South Asians contesting, and in some cases succeeding from areas and electoral districts which are primarily white majority. They run as non-ethnic candidates and engage in a deracialized campaign. An analysis of Indian American candidates who ran for local, state, and federal offices in recent years suggests that a large number of Indian American candidates contested and some succeeded from areas which have negligible South Asian or Asian American population. To a certain extent, that is true for Pakistani Americans as well. Most of these electoral districts are overwhelmingly white. Asian Americans are only a very small part of the population. I'll give you some examples here. Win Gopal got elected to New Jersey Senate from 11th Legislative District, Monmouth County, which is 76% white. Similarly, Pramila Jaipal is very well known, an Indian American member of Congress. Her district in Washington state is 76% white. Another Indian American member of Congress, Ami Bera, wins from a district in California that is 66% white. However, we are also witnessing attempts in areas where there is a relatively higher level of South Asian and Asian American concentration. Those areas are Northern California, New York City, parts of New Jersey, Houston, and Atlanta suburbs, where efforts are being made to get representation through more traditional ethnic mobilization because there is concentration of South Asians in those areas. For instance, Ro Khanna from the Bay Area in California is one example of that. He is one of the leading members of Congress of Progressive Caucus, and he's an Indian American elected from the Bay Area. So why is this trend of contesting from white majority district important to highlight for me? It is important because it provides an insight into the electoral mobilization of the community. It is distinct from the traditional mode of minority representation that is dependent on mobilization of one's own racial or ethnic group. For instance, in case of a significant number of Black and Latino candidates, mobilizing their co-ethnics is important because they are contesting from districts with large number of voters from these communities. Most Indians or South Asian candidates, however, are not reaching out for the votes of co-ethnics, and in most cases, they are appealing to an overwhelming white electorate, or in some cases, to multiracial electorate. This trend of representation is important to understand because it does very little to bring co-ethnics into the political process in terms of naturalization, registration, and voting. One of the fundamental assumptions of the dominant models of political incorporation that I talked about earlier is that in the process of seeking representation, particularly electoral representation, ethnic and racial groups mobilize their co-ethnics. The rate of naturalization, registration, voting, and other forms of participation go up as a result of that kind of mobilization. This is the process through which groups enter into the political process. We do not see much of that happening in case of South Asians. Many of the electoral attempts or successes on the part of South Asians do not lead to greater level of ethnic mobilization. And it's possible to have representation without ethnic mobilization, right? And so if you're winning from primarily white majority district, then you are not mobilizing your co-ethnics, right? So you can have representation without mobilizing the co-ethnics, right? So there is a disconnect that is emerging, which is interesting to note here. There is one kind of co-ethnic mobilization that is observed among South Asians contesting from white majority district. They reach out to their co-ethnics across the country for campaign contributions. There is evidence that a sizable part of the money is raised from co-ethnics. So they are reaching out to Indians, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis, depending on their community affiliation, right? And that kind of mobilization is happening. However, it is important to note that a very limited segment of the community, especially financially well off, are mobilized in the process. I term this as the mobilizational process limited only to the community elite. My last example is the role of South Asian Americans as important figures in raising money for presidential candidates. I have data on South Asian bundlers for 2012 presidential election. The data is a little dated, but I think the trend continues. The bundlers typically are affluent and important people in the community who organize fundraisers and bundle donations from friends, family, business, and professional associates. These kinds of contributions constitute a significant part of funds raised by presidential candidates. When you look at this table, the data presented in this table is from 2012 presidential election, so second Obama election. There were a total of 769 bundlers reported by Obama campaign. These individuals had collected money ranging from $50,000 to $500,000 for Obama campaign and more. I was able to identify by looking at their names, last names, doing research. I was able to identify 27 South Asians out of 769 bundlers on that list who were mostly Indian Americans alongside a few Pakistani. And you can see the names. It's a selected names, their ethnicity, the amount that they mobilized, they collected, and then the places where they were appointed, right? So there is a give and take, right? So if you are an important bundler, then you get placed at an important place, right? So on the right side, you will see the appointments, right? So through this process of bundling contribution, a very small section of the community manages to garner political influence with important political institutions. This points to a very distinct path of political clout and inclusion for wealthy and connected South Asians that is mostly disconnected from the larger community. As a result, a very narrow and elite segment is able to gain clout without thinking of ways to connect with and mobilize the larger community. Both these examples, contesting from white majority districts and preponderance of Indian American bundlers, suggest a disconnect between ethnic mobilization and representation and influence of selected few. The examples I have given so far in this talk very clearly illustrate how the idea of a unified ethnic mobilization is challenging. It's hard to unify the community. Internal contestation, as evident in the post 9/11 mobilization, or particular mode of politics, representation from white majority districts or bundlers, illustrate this point. However, before I end my talk, I want to give one example where we see a convergence within South Asian Americans, a possible point of unity for the moment, right? So there is one example where so far in my talk, I have talked about how there is, it's harder to unify the community and there are internal contestation. There is one example that I'm going to talk about where I think that there is a convergence within South Asian community and they come together to a certain extent, right? And what is that example? What is that possible point of unity that we should be thinking about? The trends do show that South Asians have an electoral orientation that is shared by the larger group, and it suggests some level of group cohesion as far as their electoral behavior is concerned. So the possible point of convergence that I'm talking about here is around voting. So I want to talk a little bit about that before I conclude and end my talk. Like other Asian American groups, so if you think about Asian Americans in general, Asian Americans have become more democratic voting over the last 3 to 4 election cycles over the last 20 years, right? And so that trend has continued, but that trend is more pronounced in the case of South Asian Americans. South Asian Americans are even more democratic voting than any segment of Asian American population. And we now have more quality data to show that. We have surveys that look at Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Pakistanis, and they're able to have enough samples to make strong claims about their voting patterns. So I'm going to look at 2 presidential elections and through that talk a little bit about this trend. So this is 2016 presidential election, Clinton and Trump, and this is a post-election survey. So the survey was conducted after the election, and in the survey you see a strong support for Democratic Party candidate among Asian Americans. The top line is 69% Asian Americans voted for Clinton, right? But for our purposes, in 2016, we have data on Pakistanis and Bangladeshis besides Indian Americans. And what we see is that Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, Indians are most democratic voting among all Asian Americans, right? And so there you have it, a very strong sort of trend of a large segment of community coming together around voting for Democratic Party, which suggests some level of cohesion within the community, right? And this larger trend is not one-off phenomenon, right? And so if we go back to Obama elections and if we look at 2020 elections, we see similar trend, right? So 2020 election data, important to keep in mind that this is a pre-election survey. This is not a post-election survey. So on the right, you have a percentage of population who are, who say don't know, they have not decided, right? And so the actual vote looked a little bit different, right? And so in 2000, we see a similar pattern. Important to note here that Indian Americans are the most democratic voting among all Asian Americans. There is no data on Pakistanis and Bangladeshis in 2020, but all indications suggest that they are even more democratic voting than Indian Americans. And there is a greater convergence among South Asians on the issue of electoral preference, right? Now, it's important to keep in mind that there has been a sharp shift over the past 20 years in electoral and policy preferences of Asian Americans in general, as I was saying earlier. Asian Americans have become more democratic voting, with some exceptions. There are certain groups, for example, you can see Vietnamese, for example, are more Republican voting than other Asian American groups, but larger Asian American community has become more democratic voting, right? And the trend of South Asians, as I indicated, is a little bit more pronounced. The 2020 Asian American Voter Survey reported that Indian Americans have the highest level of support among Asian Americans for policies such as greater government spending, healthcare for all regardless of immigration status, pathway to citizenship for undocumented people, stronger climate change policy, stricter gun control, and civil rights policy aimed at equality for Blacks, right? And so what you see is that the trend is true largely for Asian Americans, but what you see is that Indian Americans on policy, on progressive policy issues also, they're very pronounced in their favor of some of these more progressive policies, right? And so you see a convergence among Indian Americans, not only in terms of who they vote for, but how they think about some of the policies that are important in terms of where you align on the political spectrum. A relatively unified shift among South Asians towards the Democratic Party, despite internal cleavages along the lines of religion, caste, class, caste, and nationality, is quite remarkable, right? So the story that I tell in my book, or the one that I have narrated in this talk also, that thinking about internal differences, internal contestation is important to understand South Asian American experience, which is true, but then there is also a contradictory trend, and reality is always contradictory. So the increased racialized browning of, so if you want to understand why this is happening, I argue that the increased racialized browning of South Asian identity since 9/11 seems to have pushed the group as a whole towards a relatively more unified electoral preference. And this has been accelerated by the fact that over the last 20 years, the Republican Party has moved steadily to align itself with white racial resentment, espousing anti-immigrant rhetoric and excluding non-Christian religious minorities. Perhaps, given that reality, it's no surprise that South Asians' voting pattern have dramatically shifted in favor of Democratic Party that appears to be relatively more minority-friendly political party in the two-party system. So there is nothing absolute, it's a two-party system. So relatively, that's what they are seeing. So this is an example of South Asian Americans demonstrating a unified approach, broadly speaking, to the party electoral system in the United States. So in conclusion, I want to suggest that there are internal contestations within South Asian community, and the idea of a unified mobilization is faced with many challenges that need to be acknowledged. I talked about internal contestations through the policy that unfolded in the post 9/11 period, and how a unified response to racialization was simply not visible. There are many examples of fragmentation within the community, both given the dynamics within the US, but also given the dynamics back in home country. There were deep cleavages produced by religious identity that made a unified response highly difficult. Similarly, in the political arena, ethnic mobilization is limited because of features of electoral system that leads to many South Asians contesting from white majority district and not putting that much resources, energy, effort into thinking of ways in which to mobilize the community and bring them into the political process, because their electoral prospect is not dependent on the mobilization of the community. In my book and in my larger work, I refer to class and occupational distinctions within the community that is producing a rich variety of organizations and organizing that demand us to look at internal cleavages more carefully, right? So it's not only religion, with other kinds of distinctions also. This is particularly relevant since class divide is an important feature of most Asian American groups, right? So when we think about Asian Americans are deeply class divided, but this is particularly pronounced in case of South Asians. Folks working at gas stations, grocery stores, cab industry, construction, and other kinds of low-income jobs encounter very different kind of civic and political spaces in comparison to high income and upper middle class segments of the community. There are also, so their mobilization, their engagement with the political process is bound to be very, very different. Similarly, there are also mobilizations that highlight the continuation of caste oppression in South Asian diaspora, particularly among Indian Americans, and that is a major reality of the community in the US and in other diasporic spaces also. I have not done enough work on these divides, but they are critical issues to deal with when anyone is thinking about community mobilization. In my presentation, I also showed how South Asians are showing a more cohesive and unified electoral mobilization in favor of the Democratic Party. This electoral mobilization cuts across religion, class, and national divides. And I suggest that the post 9/11 racialization of South Asians, alongside politics of white racial resentment, and a strong version of which is represented by the Republican Party, has contributed to this unified response in electoral arena. So when we look at South Asians, we are seeing a dynamics where you have internal contestations, lack of unification, lack of unified mobilization, but you also have a dynamics where we are seeing in electoral arena a much more, relatively speaking, much more unified response. And I think I'll stop here, and I'm happy to engage with some of these themes in Q&A. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Professor Mishra. I must say there are a lot of questions that are piling up in the question queue. I think your talk clearly sparked a lot of interest and enthusiastic engagement, but I am going to take my moderator's prerogative for a moment and make a few comments, but I don't want to take too much time away from the excellent questions that I think a lot of which are coming from our students, which I'm excited to see. But first of all, I just want to thank you for a really rich and excellent presentation. I think the importance of shining a spotlight on South Asian Americans is essential for precisely the reasons that you kind of outlined in the beginning, where given the size of the South Asian immigrant population in the United States, they have a significant demographic importance, but have carry an invisibility and a lack of legibility that I think is unique to this population, particularly given its relative size and I think increasing political importance in American in elective office in American politics. I really appreciated your comments around the impacts of racial lumping. I think we tend to think about the social justice implications of racial lumping, its impact on identity formation, but I think its impact on politics, political participation, political efficacy are topics that, at least coming from sociology in my case, were somewhat newer to me. And I really appreciated hearing that, these sort of acts of kind of lumping diverse groups of people under similar umbrellas has consequences of exacerbating existing cleavages within these groups. And I appreciate that you spoke about caste-based cleavages and class cleavages toward the end, because I think, in the post 9/11 period, we were thinking primarily about religious cleavages and religious differences. But I think there is a heightened awareness about casteism in American society and casteism among South Asian immigrants and even second generation South Asians that gets passed down and integrated into American society in a way that I think had been denied for many generations and overlooked. And so I think that's a really important area. I did have questions about sort of the longer term implications, given your framing around kind of 20 years after 9/11. And it seemed as though much of your work about exacerbating political cleavages and the empirical work you were doing was in the moment sort of following September 11th or following 2001. And I did wonder to some degree if the findings you were presenting toward the end of your presentation around sort of political unity or the overwhelming democratic voter base of South Asian immigrant communities may, and which you framed in large part as a rejection of the Republican Party's emphasis on white racial identity and an embrace of a white racial identity. If there may be, some lingering implications of potentially pan-ethnic solidarities that we may see in South Asian immigrant voters' rejection of this, kind of xenophobic, white supremacist message coming out of the Republican Party. And I wondered if you saw a connection at all between those two things, thinking about sort of what might be the immediate impacts of racial lumping that didn't, as you found, result in the pan-ethnic solidarities, but may potentially have other longer-term effects, potentially. I also really wanted to ask a second question, given that my own area of research is primarily focused in India and Indian politics. It's been very interesting to me to see the amount of political support that the BJP and Narendra Modi gets among South Asian immigrants here in the US. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about whether, from your perspective as a political scientist, you see that potentially being overblown, maybe seeing, getting more media attention than it, should deserve, given the political support, in fact, or if you see something of a discrepancy between support for more right-wing politics in India, yet more support for the Democratic Party within domestic politics. And I would love to hear you speak a little bit about that. And
Okay.
so I'll pause on the questions. Perhaps you want to answer, take a brief stab at my questions, and then I will gather questions from the chat and begin posing them to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weinstein, for those very thoughtful comments and engagement with my talk, and excellent questions. Very briefly, I would say that both trends are present, right? So my book is much more inclined towards emphasizing the first trend, right? So Desi is divided, right, which is a reality, and subsequent analysis, I have started pointing to sort of some level of unity within the community, right? So both dynamics are present, and a couple of things I would think that important for us to think about, those who are interested in studying diaspora or those who are thinking about diasporic politics or minority politics. One is that South Asian community is very recent in this country, right? And so when I say that, I mean overwhelming majority of South Asians in this country have come to this country in the last 20 to 25 years, right? So their connections back home is deeply, deeply strong, right? And so those connections are the reasons why certain kinds of politics get produced, right? And newer members are joining it, right? And so given one, the preponderance or the majority of the community is first generation, only 29% or so roughly is second generation, right? And within that you have children, and then you have grown-ups, right? And so the majority of the community is foreign born, and so that trend of division has basis in the US politics, but it also has basis back home, right? And communities' connections to home countries, whether it's Indian, Pakistanis, or Bangladeshis, that is going to keep producing this kind of politics of cleavages and politics of there is an attempt to, I would say, there's a very concerted attempt in within Indian American community to produce a politics which is more around the identity of Hinduism or Hindu religious identity, right? And so don't see yourself as a racialized South Asian subject. See yourself as a Hindu subject, right? See yourself as, in terms of Hindu identity, and that kind of racial politics which is being produced, which is being attempted to produce, is bound to remain a big part of mobilization process, right? And so I would not say that distance from 9/11 means that we are moving towards more unity, right? So both these dynamics are present, but they are going to be contesting with each other. And secondly, I think second generation is different. Second generation is distant from home country, right? And that is both positive and negative, because with their lack of information, they can be persuaded in ways that might be troubling, right? But I do feel that second generation is producing a different kind of politics, and that might lead more towards unity and not disunity, right? But I would say that both are very much present and both are shaping. About Narendra Modi, no doubt, Narendra Modi is popular in India. He is popular among diaspora, diasporic population here. The nature of diasporic mobilization is, by its very definition, it's always overblown, right? Because it's being done for a particular purpose, right? And so they don't need Indian American votes. They don't need their support in the electoral arena. What they need is this perception that this part of our country, which is really talented, highly educated, affluent, and who have gone to other places, they are also behind me, right? And so it's by nature always overblown, and that's the nature of it, right? So it's hard to always gauge, right, how much support, because the community is very, very diverse. If you think about Indian American community, there is a Gujarati segment of Indian American population, but it's heavily Tamil, it's heavily Malayali, it's heavily Telugu, right? And all of that shapes the way in which these play a role, right? And so to that question, I would say, of course, he's popular, but it's by nature, it's always overblown.
Thank you for that. That was very insightful answers. So we have a few questions about South Asian American and Indian American specifically identities. The first one is from Vivian Gao. She asks, what do you think are the reasons that other groups of Asian Americans, such as East Asian or Southeast Asian Americans, for example, see South Asians as different from the Asian American identity? So why do you not see the embracing among other Asian American groups of South Asians?
That's a wonderful question, and I don't know if I can answer the question in a satisfactory way, but I'll just think loudly that it's important to keep in mind that all these identities are constructed identities, right? And so the Asian American identity is a politically constructed identity, right? It has emerged historically, and it has been constructed, and it has been used for political purposes to mobilize, right? It has also been used to target people and to for the purposes of hate crime, right? And so given the constructed nature of the political identity, I think there is always a gap between what that formal category is and how people feel about these identities, right? And so, so that gap is always there, right? When South Asians come to the US, they they're not used to the idea of Asian American identity, right? And slowly and gradually, when they go through the bureaucratic process, when they have to check a box, when they have to go through the census, they learn the fact that in this racial schema of the US society, we are Asian Americans, right? And so it's socializing, it's a process of coming to terms with that new identity, right? And so it's not, all I'm trying to say that it's not a given, right? It's not a given that a Chinese Asian American would feel same level of connection to an Indian American as he or she would feel to fellow Chinese American, right? And so in that sense, it's inculcated, it's developed, it's socialized, right? And so through socialization, for example, on my campus or on your campus, when we are reaching out to students to say that we need Asian American studies, we need minor or major in Asian American studies, who do we reach out to? When you do a town hall, when you see faces, then you realize that these are our allies, right? These are the people who are going to come together and be a part of an attempt to find a place and acknowledgement for Asian Americans and their history, right? And that's how identity is built, right? And so we have to acknowledge that there is nothing natural, there is nothing given. What is given is that distance, and it's more socialization, constructed, and building solidarity. And that's what we do when we try to build this idea of Asian American identity. But a great question. Thank you.
Yeah. Carrying on the theme of that there is nothing natural to these categories, but they're socially and politically, and in the question that that I'm about to pose, legally constructed. Claire Bofox asks, to what extent do you think that early legal fights such as Ozawa versus the United States and Tind versus the United States by Asian Americans could be considered white, specifically so that they could be naturalized citizens, has contributed to cleavages, either cleavages within the South Asian community or between South Asians and other Asian American groups? Do you think that there has been an impact of these earlier struggles to be viewed as white?
Right. I mean, again, a great question and a complicated question, a complex question to answer. But I would say that when you look at the writings of Black literary figures or Black scholars or historians, one of the statements which I've read in multiple places, that one part of becoming an American is so when you become American, you pick up on many cultural competencies and cultural things. But one of the things that you learn from American society is that it is a deeply racialized society, and there is a deeper level of antipathy towards certain racial groups, right? And so immigrants, when they come to this country, they socialize into that deep antipathy towards other, particularly Black communities or brown communities, right? And so that socialization is a part of American experience, right? And to what extent Ozawa and Thind is responsible for this fragmentation, on that I'm not very sure how to where to come on that question. there's a larger sort of politics of model minority. There's larger politics of seeing oneself as different from those who are oppressed. That is there. But when you look at Ozawa and Thind were part of a large number of cases of people from West Asia and Asia who were trying to naturalize in this country, and they, for whatever reason, they thought that the only possible path to naturalize was to make the claim that that they are white, right? And so that is a more complex history which cannot be directly put into the causation, but there are multiple factors which have contributed to sort of this whole politics of distancing from the communities which are vilified, which are racialized, which are seen as communities that are at the bottom, which are criminalized, right? That is a part of the assimilation process that was done by Irish, that was done by Italian, that was done by other Asian American groups, and that process continues. But at the same time, we also know that there have been attempts to build solidarities, build connections, build sort of more avenues for dialogue and interconnection. So that is also a part of the history that Asian American sort of identity is a part of, right? So when you think about 1960s and emergence of Asian American identity, that emergence was very much a part of larger movement of Black Panthers and other kinds of assertions, right? And so it's that dynamics is also a part of how Asian American identity has emerged.
Yeah, I think you've begun to answer my next question, but perhaps you can elaborate a little. Tom Nakayama asks, in an earlier era when South Asians were classified as non-white Caucasians, they did cultivate, or did they, this is posed as a question, did they cultivate any political alliances with Mexican Americans or others who were similarly categorized as non-white Caucasians? And I think you were speaking toward some of those solidarities in earlier eras of civil rights organizing. Do you think that they still exist or have the potential to be recultivated?
So if we look at history, I mean, history is really, really rich and interesting. South Asians, where Indian Americans have been classified in multiple ways, white, non-white, Asian, all kinds of, they have gone through all kinds of classifications, right? And so if we look at the early 20th century, South Asians they could not marry a white person because of miscegenation laws, right? Like other non-whites, right? And so what you see in that time period is a very rich history of marriages between Punjabi Sikh farmers and Mexican women in California, right? And so there are families that are Punjabi Mexican families, right? And so there are all kinds of, they were in farming, they were sort of spending time together. People talk about tortilla and beans and rajma and roti, how the similarity, cuisine similarity, that also played a role, right? And so there is a rich history of Indians and Mexicans coming together and sort of building solidarity, right? And so earlier history is much more about that kind of mobilization and transnational, right? And so there was a movement which is known as Gadar. There was a group called Gadar Party, which was supporting the independence movement in India in 1920s and 30s, and they built all kinds of alliances across races, right? And they joined labor movement, they joined other kinds of organizations, and so there are multiple examples of solidarity. So in earlier periods, I would say in 1920s, 30s, and 40s, you don't see too many examples of white South Asian, white Indian American alliances there are fewer examples of that. Post 1965 is a different story, right? Post 1965, when immigration law changed and larger number of highly educated, middle class, upper middle class South Asians started coming to the US. They started settling much more in affluent neighborhoods, in white neighborhoods. They started working in corporation and places which were much more white, right? And so there you see building of that kind of white affinity. You start seeing in that time period much more. But historically, it was a different story, right? And somebody should dig into that. And people are doing that kind of work, right? And so, so there is that. But I would also say that even today, there is the politics of white affinity, and most South Asian kids go to schools that are primarily white schools, right? But there is a way in which South Asian political mobilizing it today is much more on the left spectrum of the politics, right? And so they're building alliances with Latinos, with other Asian American groups, with Black groups, right? Whether it's Georgia, whether it's Texas, other places, right? So you see those examples, right? But white affinity is also a reality, and model minority is also a reality.
Thank you for that. I think this is related to Elena Turner's question about what factors do you think actually do contribute to South Asian Americans supporting more progressive policies and more progressive candidates when compared to other Asian American groups?
It's multiple factors that, and it's a little bit of a puzzle also, I would say, right? That South Asian Americans or Indian Americans are not necessarily most liberal in terms of their worldview, right? They come from a society which is a highly casteist society, a highly caste-ridden society. A large majority of them come from that upper strata of caste stratification, right? And so it's not that it's part of their socializing back in India, right? But when they come to the US, and the kind of factors that I sort of elaborated on, right? That there is a way in which racialization has played a major role in the ways in which they are thinking about the political process, right? And so I think one major factor is their brown identity, right? And how they are seen as people of color, right? And then in the political spectrum, so if you go back to 1990s, you would see Asian Americans and Indian Americans much more evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans, right? So it would be 50-50 divide, right? Or 55-45 divide, right? But you see a shift among Asian Americans and among South Asians, and that shift is much more about how the party system has evolved in the US in a way in which white the politics of white racial resentment has come at the center of Republican Party, right? And so that has shaped that in a big way, right? And I would also say that many policies, such as, given their profile, they are bound to think about environment in a different way, right? When I say profile, I'm saying their education, their economic background, etc. They're bound to think about environment in different way. They're bound to think about gun laws in a different way, right? And there is a way in which some of these questions are, for example, the question of healthcare is something that they're bound to think about in a different way, right? And I would add another layer to this, that many of the Asian American communities are coming from backgrounds where they are sort of reacting to um, mm, sort of socialism slash communism, that kind of background. In case of Indian or Pakistanis or Bangladeshis, you do not see that. They are not reacting to socialism, communism in that manner. That's not something on the basis of which they can be mobilized, right? So that has also allowed the community to engage with the political process in a little bit different way in comparison to, let's say, particularly Chinese community or mm, sort of Vietnamese for sure, right? And so those are the factors which are important factors, but these are something that we are still trying to fully grasp, right? How does this politics evolve? Is it something that is enduring, or is it something that is going to change, right? Is it something that is going to, it's something that is temporary and then the community would evolve differently, right? That's what we're trying to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a really interesting point about the ways that the sort of anti-socialist, anti-communist rhetoric of the Republican Party plays differently on South Asian communities where there are, regional, state level, democratically elected communist governments in Kerala and West Bengal, and it has a very different resonance and what communism and socialism mean in that context, as opposed to in context where there are non-democratic, authoritarian communist parties in power. And
I would just quickly add one thing, that what Republican Party has done in the at least last election cycle, and maybe in 2016 also, that people who pay attention to sort of these minutiae of community politics, they thought, and it's very obvious that they thought that aligning themselves with Narendra Modi and his politics is going to win over Indian Americans, right? And so what you see in Republican Party and Republican campaigns is that they are constantly pushing this idea of Hindu identity, right? And that Democratic Party is in favor of taking Kashmir out of India. Democratic Party is in favor of Pakistan and it's pro-terrorist and all of that, right? So that kind of sort of communal is a word which is used more in India, but that kind of polarization on religious identity basis is something that they have tried. But I would say that it has not succeeded, right? And so even and there is not enough research on this, but even those who are Hindu right-wing in the community here, it's not that all Hindu right-wings are Republican. A large segment of that is Democratic, right? And so you see Hindu right-wing populating Democratic Party in interesting ways, right? And where it becomes much more difficult to challenge that politics, even within Democratic Party, because that's where many of them are sitting and building their alliances, right? So that dynamics is also something to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. When you talk about that, I think about Benedict Anderson's notion of overseas nationalism, where there's a particular politics toward the homeland, this sense of sort of keeping it conservative that may be disconnected from their, second generation, first generation's engagements with American politics or politics in their place of residence. And I think that discrepancy is actually a really interesting thing to explore. One of the things that I've also been thinking about while listening to your talk is there have been some really excellent essays over the past year or so, as 2021 was the 30th anniversary of Mir Nair's film, Mississippi Masala. And there have been some and the coinciding of the 30th anniversary of that film with the visibility of anti-Asian hate alongside the visibility of Black Lives Matter protests. And I think it's sort of given us a model or a way to talk about African American and Black and South Asian solidarities in a way that there's just so little, with the exception of that film, sort of images in our popular culture around that intersection. And I had that thought while you were speaking about it. I don't know if you have any reaction to that film, but it was very impactful for me when I watched it as a kid, and have rewatched it more recently in light of its 30th.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt about that, and there's a way in which we don't have that kind of work in contemporary times, right? And so there is a way in which that question of building alliances or thinking about sort of the ways in which we need to think through the question of our relationship with communities that we are politically aligned with, right? So we might be politically aligned with that community, but our social life, right? Our social life, we are much more white adjacent, right? And so that is that reality is something that is a big part of it, right? And that question again is also kind of true for larger Asian American community, right? So that when we are thinking about building programs like Asian American Studies, major, minor, in small universities, big universities, what is it about? Is it about just representation of Asian Americans, or is it about trying to engage with the larger politics of racial hierarchy in the US, right? And trying to sort of place Asian Americans and South Asians in that larger hierarchy of racial oppression, right? And we become a part of larger sort of attempt to understand racial politics and ethnic politics in the US, right? And that's something that is very, very important. And the other point that I think is also not necessarily related to this, that for the longest time, Asian American mobilization has been sort of mired by this whole thinking that as Asian Americans, we need to show that we are Americans, right? And so excessive sort of focus on being American and not thinking about transnational dimensions, right? That we are Asian Americans because we have some connections to Asia, right? So that larger politics of whether we call it anti-colonial politics or anti-imperial politics, right? That we are, as individuals, we are transnationals, right? And we have to push back against this idea of sort of thinking more along the lines of getting representation in particular kind of national imagination, right? And I've been thinking a lot about this whole attempt by Trump administration, and which continued later on, and now they are pulling back to target particularly Chinese academics, right, who are getting funding from who have collaborative relationship with universities and institutions in China, and how there are very, very serious cases against them at Harvard, at MIT, right? And so that whole politics of trying to challenge a very narrow kind of nationalism is also a part of Asian American identity. It's not only about getting representation in Congress or getting recognized as American. It's more about that larger politics, which is more expansive. That is also an important part of how we should think about Asian American identity.
Yes, and we are nearly at time, so I'm going to pose one more question from the chat. There are several excellent questions, and my apologies to those members of the audience whose questions we didn't get to discuss today. But I want to end with what is not at all a simple one, and one that I know that we are not going to fully address today. So I put that out there as I asked the question. So P. Dubé has asked, so even though there has been some unification in the South Asian community regarding voting behavior, as you outlined, you've spoken about schisms, class-based, caste-based, within the South Asian community, and this is the question concerning how can the community overcome the fact that South Asians with access to financial and political capital, primarily upper caste Hindus, tend to promote policies that further marginalize Muslims, which seems to further fragment the South Asian diaspora in the US. So it's sort of a, what can we do? How can we sort of address this challenge in the community?
That's a very important question. That's a very serious question, given what's happening in India as we speak, right? So if anybody follows India, you know that in the last 48 to 72 hours, there has been a massive uproar in the state of Karnataka about allowing women who wear headscarf into schools and colleges, particularly in colleges. And there are marches, there are violent skirmishes between communities, right? And Karnataka High Court just last evening, I think, gave this decision that until further notice, nobody is allowed to wear any kind of clothing which sparks controversy, right? So women are not allowed to wear headscarf into colleges, right? So that's the decision for now, right? And so it's deeply polarizing and polarized in India and in South Asia, right? And so it is really important that we engage with that, right? We do not distance ourselves with that, right? So one response from the community could be that's back home, right? If you're interested in politics, let's focus on Georgia, let's focus on turning Texas blue, right? All of that is great, right? Depending on your political inclination, but it's very important that community constantly engages with those questions, right? Because what's happening in the US in terms of polarization along religious lines is something that is deeply linked to what is happening in South Asia, right? What's happening in Kashmir, what's happening between India and Pakistan, right? And so our first attempt should be to inform ourselves, right? And so if you are a person, let's say of second generation, right? And you feel that, oh, I cannot engage with these questions because they are too complicated, right? I've never heard about these. I did not grow up reading these, right? And so I just know that my parents talk about this stuff and they're a particular kind of viewpoint, right? And so there's a feeling of, how can I take a position on this complicated question, right? And so our first task is to empower ourselves, right? And to meet people, to know people, and to find ways to inform ourselves, right? Because that is how we will empower ourselves, and that is how we will force the community, which is because of their privilege, because of their identity, they're unwilling to speak. We can force them to think about this question, right? And so that's I think there are many things that we can do, but that's I don't know who asked the question, but depending on who you are, I mean, there are lots of things that we can do, but that's something that we can do, and that's connected to what we are trying to do, right? We are trying to sort of connect Asian American studies to larger Asian studies, right? And build that synergy, right? And the second thing I would say is that I am very skeptical of any kind of thinking which thinks that we can turn the community around, right? And so you can produce a particular kind of politics, right? And you can produce a particular kind of politics and make it so intense that it becomes a big presence in the community, but you cannot change everyone, right? So Hindu right-wing or Hindu mobilization, or what we call in India Hindutva mobilization, is a big reality in South Asian community today. We cannot eradicate that, right? But what we can do is to produce a particular kind of politics, right? And so my own sort of entry into this conversation is that one should not think of politics as a united politics. Politics is always contentious, right? And so you want to produce a politics which contends with that and which is able to challenge that politics, but I don't have any illusions about producing a unified politics and turning community into something that they are not. I mean,
Well,
it could be a pessimistic note, but it's
yeah,
important.
your first part of the answer to the question was very inspiring, and I felt very optimistic and ready. And then we ended with sort of a dose of a little more cynicism or a little more reservation. But I really appreciated both sides of your answer and your entire talk this evening. I really have benefited immensely from the opportunity to be able to engage with you. So I'm going to hand the floor back for closing remarks to Professor Tai.
Okay, thank you everyone for that very thoughtful conversation. Thank you again, Professor Mishra, for your wonderful talk. Thank you for linking Asia, America, and the world, the theme of this speaker series, very so nicely. Thank you again to Professor Weinstein for your moderation. And finally, thank you to the audience for your questions and participation, even though we didn't have time to get to everyone's questions. Let me wrap up this event with two announcements. First, everyone who has registered for this event will receive a post-event survey by email. The survey basically asks you to provide feedback on the event. The survey is completely voluntary and anonymous, but you can provide your name and contact information to enter into a raffle. We are raffling copies of Professor Mishra's book, so please don't miss out on this opportunity. Second, the next and final event of the Asia, America, and the World Speaker Series for this academic year is on Thursday, March 24th at 4 p.m. The speaker is Professor Moonho Jung, a very important scholar of history and Asian American studies at the University of Washington. His talk is entitled Menace to Empire, Anti-Colonial Solidarities and the Trans-Pacific Origins of the U.S. Security State. Be sure to register if you are interested. And with that, I will conclude the event. Thank you all very much, and please take care.